For almost 200 years, these particular symbols sat carved into stone, copied into notebooks, photographed by tourists, and walked past by millions, and not one person could read them. Scholars assumed they were decorative, filler, the ancient equivalent of a border pattern around something that actually mattered. They were wrong, because when these glyphs were finally pieced together, line by line, panel by panel, they didn't describe a king. They didn't list grain or gold or the names of the dead. They described something the Egyptians believed was coming, something they were so certain about that they buried the message in stone, hoping someone, thousands of years later, would finally understand it. And the closer you read it, the more it stops sounding like history. It starts sounding like a warning. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you're going to understand exactly what they were trying to tell us, and why almost nobody noticed it for so long. If you find this as unsettling as I did, the full decoded text is in a short book and audiobook I'll point you to later, but you don't need it to follow along. Everything you need is right here. Let's start with why nobody could read it in the first place. Here's the thing most people get wrong about hieroglyphs. We think of them as a solved language. We think Champollion cracked the code in 1822, the Rosetta Stone gave us the key, and that was that. Every wall in Egypt suddenly readable like a paragraph in a book. That's not what happened. What Champollion actually unlocked was the alphabet, the phonetics. The way the little chick meant a U sound, the way the shepherd's crook meant ruler, the way the names of pharaohs sat inside those oval rings we now call cartouches. That was the breakthrough, and it was enormous. It turned a wall of pictures into a wall of words. But knowing the sounds of a language is not the same as understanding what it's saying. Think about it this way. You can sound out a sentence in a language you don't speak. You can read every letter perfectly and still have no idea whether you just read a shopping list or a death threat. The Egyptians wrote in a script that was figurative, symbolic, and phonetic, sometimes all three in the same word, in the same breath. A single image could be a sound, an object, and an idea at once, and which one depended entirely on context. And context is exactly what we lost. When the last person who could actually read hieroglyphs died, somewhere around the 4th or 5th century AD, they didn't just take the alphabet with them. They took the way of thinking, the assumptions, the meaning underneath the meaning. For over 1,000 years, Europe looked at these symbols and convinced itself they were pure mysticism, magical pictures, each one standing for some grand secret idea, with no language behind them at all. That single wrong assumption set everyone back by centuries. So, when certain inscriptions came along that didn't fit the neat pattern, that weren't a king bragging about a battle or a priest listing offerings, scholars did the most human thing imaginable. They skipped them. They labeled them religious formula, ritual repetition, background text, the boring part, and they moved on to the parts that gave them what they were looking for: dates, names, conquests, treasure. The warning was sitting right there the whole time, in plain sight. It just didn't look like a warning to anyone hunting for gold. To understand what these glyphs were actually saying, you have to understand the single idea that the entire Egyptian world was built around. The Egyptians had a word, ma'at. We translate it as order, or truth, or justice, or balance. And all of those are right, and all of those are incomplete. Ma'at wasn't a law. It wasn't a rule you followed. It was the invisible structure holding the entire universe together. The sun rising, the Nile flooding on schedule, the seasons turning, kings ruling justly, a son honoring his father. To the Egyptian mind, these weren't separate things. They were all the same thing. They were all Ma'at, expressing itself. And Ma'at had an enemy. They called it Isfet, chaos, disorder, injustice, violence, the slow rot that crept in at the edges of the ordered world, always pressing, always waiting for a gap. Here's the part that matters. the part that changes how you read everything they left behind. The Egyptians did not believe order was permanent. This is the thing we get wrong about them. We look at the pyramids, the monuments, the sheer scale of it all, and we imagine a people who thought they were building something eternal and unshakable, but that's our projection. The Egyptians believed almost the opposite. They believed that order was fragile, that it was constantly under threat, that chaos was not a one-time event at the beginning of the world, but a force that returned again and again in cycles, and that holding it back was not a victory you won once. It was a duty you performed every single day, forever, or everything came apart. Their whole civilization was a machine built to repel chaos. The rituals, the temples, the offerings, the pharaoh himself, every bit of it existed to keep Maat intact and push Isfet back into the dark. And they had watched it fail. Over 3,000 years, the Egyptians didn't just imagine collapse in theory. They lived through it. They saw kingdoms rise and shatter. They saw central authority dissolve into warlords and famine. They saw periods historians now call intermediate periods, stretches where the rivers seemed to turn against them, where rulers lost their grip, where the country fractured and the old certainties dissolved. And then, somehow, they saw order return. A new dynasty, a new stability, the cycle closing and beginning again. They didn't experience this as random misfortune. They experienced it as a pattern. And a civilization that believes collapse is a pattern, a recurring, predictable rhythm woven into the fabric of reality, does not just shrug when it sees the signs. It writes them down carefully, permanently, for whoever comes next. That's what these glyphs are. And once you understand that, you can't unsee it. Because suddenly all that decorative ritual text, the stuff scholars skipped for 2 centuries, stops looking like decoration. It starts looking like a people who had stared collapse directly in the face, recognized its rhythm, and refused to let the lesson die with them. The repetition isn't filler. The repetition is emphasis. They were saying the same thing over and over because they were afraid we wouldn't hear it the first time. So let's get to it. What did they write? When you stop treating these passages as decorative ritual and start reading them as a connected message, a sequence emerges. And the sequence is not a prophecy in the way we imagine prophecy. No specific dates, no named cities, no, in the year of such and such this shall occur. It's something stranger and, honestly, more disturbing. It's a description of conditions. The first thing the inscriptions do is mark a beginning and an end. The priests tied the great turning points of history to alignments in the sky, moments they could observe and track. To them, the cosmos and the calendar were the same document. The heavens told you where you were in the cycle. So the very first thing these glyphs establish is, we are keeping time. We are watching the wheel turn. And we know where on the wheel the dangerous part lives. Then come the warnings themselves. The signs the Egyptians believed appeared before every period of upheaval. Not predictions of the future, exactly. More like a checklist. A pattern they had seen play out enough times to recognize on sight. The signs cluster around a single idea: the breakdown of the bond between the ruler and Ma'at. In Egyptian belief, the pharaoh wasn't just a politician. He was the living guarantee of cosmic order. His entire job, the reason he existed, was to embody Ma'at and hold back Isfet on behalf of everyone. So the inscriptions describe, in unsettling detail, what happens when a ruler loses that. When the one who is supposed to hold the line stops upholding truth and justice. When the bond between earthly power and cosmic order snaps. And the glyphs are blunt about the consequences. They describe order unraveling from the top down. They describe the connection between what happens in the heavens and what happens on the ground. The idea that when human leadership abandons balance, the natural world itself seems to follow it into chaos. The rivers fail. The harvests fail. The center cannot hold. Famine, fracture, the return of the primordial disorder that was always waiting just outside the walls. You can feel the logic of a people who had watched it happen. They weren't being superstitious. They were being empirical in their own framework. They had observed, across centuries, that societal collapse seemed to follow a recognizable arc, that it announced itself before it arrived. And they were trying to encode that arc so it would survive them. But here's the detail that genuinely stops you. The Egyptians did not write these warnings in one place. They scattered them. A piece here on a temple wall, a piece there sealed in a tomb, a piece somewhere else preserved in a scroll meant to outlast the building it sat in. Historians for 2 centuries studied these texts separately, one inscription at a time, each one filed under its own little category, each one looking like an isolated fragment of religious boilerplate. The Egyptians did not write them separately. When you bring the pieces together, when you read them as one connected document, the way they may have been intended, a different picture emerges entirely. Not a scattered set of ritual phrases, a single, deliberate message broken into pieces and hidden across a civilization, so that no single disaster, no single looting, no single collapse could ever erase all of it at once. They built redundancy into a warning, the way we build backups into a hard drive. A wall could be defaced, a tomb could be robbed, a scroll could burn, but all of them at once? Across a whole kingdom? The message was engineered to survive the very collapse it was describing, which means the people who wrote it fully expected that collapse to come. They weren't hoping it wouldn't happen. They were planning for the moment after it did. That is not the behavior of people decorating a wall. That is the behavior of people who were terrified of being forgotten and who believed with total conviction that the thing they knew was important enough to risk everything to preserve. And then there's the last piece, the one that's hardest to shake. The final part of the message isn't hidden in a vault or buried under a mountain. According to the way these glyphs read when assembled, the final code was left in plain sight, a pattern designed to sit out in the open for thousands of years, waiting not to be discovered, but to be recognized. Because that's the cruel genius of it. A secret buried deep gets dug up, eventually examined, cataloged, understood. But a pattern hiding in plain sight? That's the one that survives the longest, because everyone assumes someone else already figured it out. Everyone walks past it, everyone sees it, and no one reads it. The Egyptians seem to have understood something about how knowledge gets lost. It doesn't usually vanish in fire. It vanishes in plain sight, when the people who could understand it stop existing and the people who come after stop looking. So they made a bet. They bet that if they wrote it big enough, scattered it widely enough, and tied it to the eternal rhythm of the stars, then one day, long after their language was dead, long after their gods were forgotten, long after their names had crumbled off the walls, someone would stand in front of these symbols, put the pieces together, and finally hear what they'd been shouting across 3,000 years of silence. The message was never really about Egypt. The Egyptians weren't warning their own people. Their own people already knew. They were performing Ma'at one last time, in the only way that could outlive them. They were warning whoever came next, any civilization, in any age, that believed it was permanent. That believed order was something you inherit rather than something you maintain. That believed collapse was something that happened to other people in other times on the far side of a line you'd never cross. They had crossed that line themselves more than once, and they had survived it just often enough to write down what it looked like on the way in. The monuments remain. The inscriptions remain. The only question they left us is the one they couldn't answer themselves. The question of whether anyone would actually listen. Let me say it as plainly as the glyphs say it, now that you have the full context. The warning is this: order is not the natural state of the world. Chaos is. Order is the thing you build against the current. And the moment you stop building, the moment you mistake a temporary calm for a permanent achievement, the moment leadership abandons truth, the moment a society stops performing the daily, unglamorous work of holding itself together, the current takes it back. Not slowly, not gently, in a recognizable, repeating pattern that announces itself before it arrives, if you know how to read the signs. The Egyptians spent 3,000 years learning to read those signs. And then they spent enormous effort making sure the signs would still be readable long after they were gone. That's why this isn't really a story about a dead language. It's a story about a civilization that understood its own mortality more clearly than almost any that came after it, and tried to do something about it. Tried to reach forward through time and tap us on the shoulder. We just took 200 years to turn around. Now, everything I've walked you through here is the shape of it, the thread that ties these scattered inscriptions into a single message. But the full decoded text, all 12 of the codes, line by line, with nothing held back, goes much deeper than I can fit into one video. And I've laid the entire thing out, fully decoded, in a short book and audiobook you can find linked in the description below. If this gave you chills, that's exactly why I made it. So do me one favor before you go. Sit with the question the Egyptians actually left us, because they clearly thought it was the only one that mattered. Why did they believe these warnings were important enough to preserve for thousands of years, and what did they see coming that made them so sure? I'll see you in the next one.